Hi, I'm Martin Kelly of Friends Journal, and today we have a Quaker author chat, and I'm here with Lynette Love. Hi, Lynette.
Hi, how are you today?
Oh, I'm very good. Lynette Love grew up in South Carolina Low Country in the Old Village in Mount Pleasant. She is a graduate of the Lang School, just like her mother and other family members for several generations. She holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry from North Carolina Central University, is a lover of history, and has published a Bible study on John 14 to 17. And here we're talking about led by God to help educate freedmen. So there's a Quaker in this story. Tell us about Cornelia Hancock and how her early life and how she ended up in the South Carolina Low Country.
Okay, when I think about her, and as I tell the history, I'm reminded of how one person can make a difference. And this is one person that what she started impacted the lives of thousands of the descendants of the plantations in my town, the emancipated people, and it reached across several generations. And she was a young Quaker lady that decided when the Civil War started, she was going to go and help nurse the soldiers. And that was very much so out of the gender norms for
Yeah.
her time. And she had her mother's approval, but she snuck off and she ended up nursing at some of the biggest, bloodiest battles in the Civil War, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, and also she was there for the siege of Petersburg and the surrender of Richmond.
These are all,
And
yeah, big battles,
big
lots of
battles.
nursing to
And
be done. Yeah.
she saw a lot and she experienced a lot. And I say that by the time she came to our town in South Carolina, she was essentially a battle-hardened veteran. And she did get exposed to the contrabands while she was nursing or in between the battles. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit
Yeah.
later.
What's the contraband? Tell us about that.
Well, contrabands are basically there were they say between 500,000 to 800,000 of them as the Union Army started marching through the South. The slaves, when they heard the Union Army was nearby, they ran to behind the Union lines. And it ended up being quite a humanitarian crisis because you had all of these people, 500,000 of them, who came with nothing.
Yeah.
And they were following the Union Army, but they were there to fight a war with a pretty determined enemy, and that was not a part of their original plan. So General Grant and several others called for help with the contrabands.
Hmm.
And in between, I think it was in between Wilderness and Petersburg, she went to DC and she served as a nurse in a contraband hospital. Those people went through a lot. Generally came, they were compromised, their health was compromised. Sometimes it went through a lot to even get to freedom. And then there was a lot of sickness and death in those camps. The smallpox was quite a problem for them and the soldiers and everybody else during the Civil War. So it was a lot of death. And she worked in the contraband hospital in Washington, D.C. in between the battles. And she also worked in a school for them. But the one thing about the contrabands is that um, they started the Freedmen Schools movement started in those camps. You had all these people and people were they sent clothes, they sent food, they sent aid, and then they started sending books, and then they opened schools in those
Nice.
camps. And of course, after the war, that proliferated. There were like 3,000 freedmen schools in the South after the
I
Civil War.
assume that the slaves were not allowed to read and write. I mean, that wasn't a practice to be taught reading and writing.
Right.
Yeah.
Not in slavery, and they really clamped down on it in the middle to late 1800s because of insurrections and John Brown and yeah.
Well, that's amazing. I live not too far from where Cornelia Hancock came from. Little Hancock's Bridge, which is this tiny little town. It's like maybe 12 streets. It's
Right.
basically along like the highway that goes kind of along the coast. It's all salt marshes down there, and past Hancock's Bridge, it's just winding rivers to the sea. And it always kind of reminds me whenever I'm down in South Carolina, I'm like, oh, I feel kind of at home.
Uh-huh.
That is sort of similar, but it's also just sort of amazing that someone from this place, this small little, not even probably incorporated town, could have this bravery to go and do all this nursing at the greatest battles and being at the camps and then going and teaching.
I mean, she was a fiery little girl. I think there was probably an evolving of her brought on by what she saw in the Civil War. But I think there was just a core bravery and tenacity that existed in that young woman.
So tell us about the school then. How did she get down to South Carolina?
Well, I think when she was teaching in the contraband camp in Washington D.C., she decided that that was something she was interested in after the war was over. And she said she was called by God to go.
Yeah.
And so she went to Charleston, and then she decided to go over to Mount Pleasant, and she looked around and saw that that would be a field of service that she would work in. So she started the school in a church that had bullet holes in the roof, and it had been a Confederate hospital for the
Mhm.
Confederate soldiers. And she worked with the South was occupied by the Union for what, 8, 9 years after the war. And she worked with the occupying Union Army and then the Freedmen's Bureau to get what she needed for the school. But she also gained backing from those two organizations in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And I always have to get this one right because there are a lot of words in it.
Organizations are like that.
Yeah, it was the Friends Association for the Aid and Elevation of Freedmen, and that was in Philadelphia. And those two organizations, and then
Yeah.
the Quakers in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania. She was a prolific record keeper, and she has records of just all the supplies that the Quakers sent, school supplies, eat for the people in the town, clothing, shoes.
Mm.
Because when she came to Mount Pleasant in 1866, one year after the Civil War, the South had been really kind of devastated, and
Sure.
the
The
slaves.
infrastructure was probably
Mhm.
destroyed, or a lot of the
Yeah,
roads probably a mess, and
yeah,
farms
and
are
and
not.
the economic
Yeah,
structure turned upside down,
sure.
and so the people everybody was suffering really, but the enslaved people had nothing. And so she was like, relief agency and worked with those organizations and worked with the army and worked with the army and the Freedmen's Bureau and helped to get aid to the people as well as the supplies for the school. And she saw the need for clothes and shoes. And so in the school, she started cobbling classes for shoes and dressmaking classes.
Those are good careers, probably to people to be trained in.
Yes. And
Good solid careers at that time.
the need was tremendous at that time for the South. So she kind of saw a need and came up with um, classes as a way to address the need and other things as well. She was a prolific letter writer, which we know that from the Civil War because there have been what, 3 books written about the letters that she wrote during the Civil War. And sometimes you see what she wrote as references, especially when it comes to the care of the soldiers. And but also she kept a list of the monthly contributions of the people from New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania. And you can see those. There's a collection of a land collection at the University of South Carolina. It's actually called the Abby Monroe Collection, but her information is in there as well. And It's just so amazing to me as I sat here 2 years ago reading the names of people from places in New Jersey and New York, and they sent this, they sent $1, they sent $5, they sent $25, and they sent barrels and barrels of supplies. And
She's like a prolific fundraiser here. She's the record keeper. Of course, there's the classes, there's the nursing people back to health, there's helping to build infrastructure, there's all the negotiation that must have happened with the armies there.
just think about they're in a strange land, they're away from their family. They dealt with sickness as well. The teachers struggled with sicknesses as well. So, these women were heroes.
Tell us about its present continuation.
Cornelia ran Lang for 10 years,
Mhm.
and she was followed by a missionary from Rhode Island, Abby Monroe, who ran Lang for 37 years.
Wow.
And left it on, she picked up the baton from Cornelia and ran with it and left it on very good standing. During those two women's era, the principals and most of the teachers were white. And after Abby Monroe, and part of that reason was, there weren't that many Negroes or Black people who were trained to be teachers. But one of the missions that they had in the Freedom Schools movement was to train men and women to come after them and teach. So after Abby Monroe, there were 10 principals of Lang School altogether. And the 8 that came after her were just tough. They were just wonderful educators. They were just so dedicated and so persevering. They went through a lot of stuff, a lot of challenges. And I tell that history, the whole history, I tell it through the voices and eyes of 3 of the female women, 2 I've already mentioned, Cornelia and Abby Monroe, and then Miriam Brown, who was someone that I knew personally. She lived across the street from me.
And you went to Lang School. I don't know if we've talked about that much.
Yes,
So
I went to Lang Elementary School.
Mhm.
And so the school persevered. It was segregated for up until 1970. And in 1970, integration came about, and I was sort of caught up in that. It lasted, exists today as a fully integrated STEM school, science, technology, and engineering school and math school in Mount Pleasant. And of course, it has a beautiful new building there. And that is lasted for 160 years, but about 150 years of those, it was that segregated old Lang school that my mother went to, and my grandfather, relatives in the community. And one thing that's so key about that school is just how much it was loved.
it's part of your whole ancestral lore here is the Lang School. Yeah, must be.
Yes. And it was kind of like for many years a safe place for the kids. In racially troubling times, it was also just the center of the community, and just love and pride always for that school.
So you have a
Mhm.
book.
Yes.
Our article is just a piece of that. Smashing Obstacles and Building Legacies, Lang School and Freedmen Schools.
Mhm.
Um, and you've told me it's become controversial suddenly. You want to share some of the stories about this book?
Yeah. Much, much to my surprise, it has been targeted. It's being sold. I was able to get it in the National Park Services gift shops in the Charleston area, which, I was very excited about that when it happened. But in the past month, under the new Trump guidelines, they told the employees to read the books and target the ones that speak disparagingly about America. And also there are 10 books that have been identified to be reviewed for possible removal. And in those 10 books, there are books about slavery, or they are books written by Black authors. And mine is one which I am just amazed that it could be controversial. And I've tried to, figure out, well, what possibly would have been controversial about that?
Hmm.
And so it's being reviewed along with these 10 other books, and they'll let me know. I mean, I feel I did a lot of research on this book. I spent probably a year reading and researching,
Yeah.
and I, would discover this and it would lead to more stories. Like, for example, and I talked about the contrabands. I knew nothing about the contrabands.
Yeah, that's a whole
That
fascinating history. I've gone down that rabbit hole and looked at, where they were in the Washington area, and um, fascinating history that we really should remember.
500,000 people.
Amazing.
And I and the only reason I kind of really came on it is from reading Cornelia's letters, and she started talking about them. So I'm like, let me find out what this is about. But maybe that was an issue. I don't really know. I was very surprised and then very concerned because it seems like censure.
Yeah.
And it's like they only want happy stories. And well, life is not like that. There's the good and the bad, and then so is history. So you have to tell the whole story. So I don't know. I just think we as Americans need to be very concerned about some of the things that are happening, that are not in line with a democratic government. It's really kind of concerning about where all of this is headed. And the book went through a vetting process. You don't just put a book in the National Park Services. They vetted it and then said, okay. So I guess one question I would have is there new criteria? Well, they've already told us anything they consider disparaging about America.
Yeah.
But
Inappropriately disparages Americans past or living was one of
yeah,
the quotes I saw. Yeah.
yeah. And then did you see the name of the directive? It's a directive for restoration of truth and sanity in American history. But I think they really are not interested in truth.
Mm. Yeah.
They're more interested in indoctrination and yeah, as opposed to, the truth.
Yeah, and I always, whenever I'm at a National Park Service, I'm always there in the library and pulling out things. So I do really hope that they continue to publish it, that whatever review process clears it and clears even some of the other books. I was looking at some of the other books that were flagged down there in Charleston. I was like, I read that one in college, and I've read
Mhm,
this author
mhm,
online. So I mean, they're important histories that we need
mhm.
to remember.
Well, one thing about it is they have control over the National Park Services and the gift shops there. So they were able to implement this thing in that agency. And so they don't have control over bookstores and other places
Sure.
like that. But I think it's kind of like a blueprint for what they want to happen all across America. The
Yeah.
question remains, will it?
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, the park. I really do like. I stop into a Park Service bookstore. We have many books that have come from National Park Service. So I'm really hoping this does get back, and that they remember this is history that people should be knowing about and should be exposed to.
Absolutely. Slavery absolutely did happen. There's some, I don't know, reluctance to talk about it, but I grew up in Charleston, in the Charleston area, and Charleston is really just now starting to talk about that aspect of their history. In the last 15 years, they're just now speaking about it. But you know, the are you familiar with the Massachusetts 54th?
It was one of the regiments. I don't remember which
Right.
they were.
Yeah, there was a movie about it with Denzel Washington in it.
Right.
And they fought in Charleston, Fort Wagner, which is 24 minutes from my house. And and they were stationed on the street that I grew up in Mount Pleasant after the war, before they, they stayed around for a little bit and then they bivouacked out. I had heard nothing about that. was sitting in the movie with Denzel Washington and Glory, and they're talking about Wagner Island, and I'm thinking, this is only 24 minutes from my house. How did I not know about this? So I'm just saying that Charles Smith is now reconciling and speaking about all of its history, and I hope that does not end. Well, it won't end really. You can't stop it.
But good to remember it. And Charleston, of course, had that horrible massacre at the
Mhm.
Black Church. What was it, 8, 10 years ago? So,
Yeah.
we're still living with this history of trying to reconcile race and anger and violence. So we need to keep remembering our histories and staying in solidarity and memory.
You know, one thing, and I know we might be running over, one thing that really stood out for me as I read all this information and put this book together was, there were ordinary American citizens during the Civil War and right after who looked at what was happening in this country, and they knew that they had to do something to help right the ship. And so, they collaborated on with the contrabands in those camps. And when there was a need, they sent all these shoes and clothes and aids. Amazing, amazing. And then after the war, and even during the war, had agencies that, like the Sanitary Commission and others, who actually went on the battlefield and brought stuff for the soldiers. And after the war, they saw there were like 4 million people who had been emancipated. What are you going to do with them? They thought education was the thing most needed, and they collaborated. The freedmen, the Quakers, and the abolitionists, the Freedmen's Bureau, and they built a system of over 3,000 schools for the freedmen. So I think they set a marvelous example for us to follow in terms of when we look at this country and we see dire needs, and we're often called to do something to help, and they set the example for it. And it's not always, fighting for freedom. It's not always about soldiers on a battlefield fighting with guns and
Yeah.
weapons.
Not picking up the guns, but picking up the books and just devoting your life to it. Just the amount of time and effort, and Cornelia, that she did and that the others did, just to go and uproot your life and leave quiet southern New Jersey there and go
Mhm.
down and be at the worst battles and then be at the school for all those years. It's
Mhm.
an amazing um legacy. It's inspiring. I feel like, well, what have I done in comparison? But
That's what I
um
said too. You know, She just set an example, and I found new heroes, as I read this history and put this book together, and have been inspired, by a lot of what I read. And it's nothing negative about it. I mean, some of the things that happened were negative, but the bottom line is, what do we ultimately do about it?
I'm glad you've shared this with us. This article is in the current August Friends Journal, and I encourage everyone to check it out. And I'll have show notes with the links to it all. So thank you so much, Lynette, for
Thank you.
um, taking this time with me today. And I do hope you keep an update about the status of the book there in the Park Service bookstore.
I will. Thank you so
Thank you.
much for having me.
Thank you. Bye bye.
All righty. Bye bye.